Hello, this is Mr. Ferreira, and I'm going to be talking you through explanations for gambling addiction and specifically as applied to learning theory and partial and variable reinforcement. Before we go into too much detail, it's worth having an understanding of what gambling addiction looks like. And here we have a copy of the DSM-5 criteria for gambling disorder. And this is a diagnosis that requires you to have four or more, it says here, of the following over a 12-month period. Now we see for the first three, there's quite a lot of that is linked to any generic form of addiction. So things like increasing the amounts of gambling, that's certainly as related to tolerance, um, dependence, and relapse. But what we're talking about by gambling addiction is something a bit more serious than the casual gambler or even the regular gambler. Now, as we move further down, this preoccupied nature of gambling is very similar to what I've mentioned before in terms of salience, kind of thinking about it all the time. But what we also find is that gambling affects people who may gamble in order to kind of relieve themselves in terms of when they feel distressed. We also have this prospect of with gambling called chasing, where people kind of have to bet more in order to kind of reset the losses that they have. But ultimately, if we look at point H there, it says has jeopardized or lost significant relationships, job or educational or career opportunities. So this is quite serious if you're prepared to put your family and or kind of career opportunities at bay just in order to kind of perpetuate a gambling kind of addiction in this particular case. So you don't need to know anything specifically about how to diagnose a gambling addict, but gives you quite a good idea that gambling in itself is a behavioral addiction that is just as serious as a substance abuse addiction. However, as we discussed in class, there's a possibility that we do view substance abuse as kind of being kind of almost more serious than a behavioral addiction. But if we look at this particular diagnostic criteria, we see that what's important here is that it's a problem, that addiction is a problem. Now, also, one of the things I like to do is to kind of find some obscure research to kind of help you find kind of how learning can be applied to addiction. And for this, I have access to a study by Christopher. I also quite like the idea of pigeons gambling. Now, of course, this is not examinable. However, you could refer to it in a evaluation point in that we are able to simulate the gambling experience for animals and they become as kind of addicted to gambling as they would be to any other kind of destructive kind of substances. What we find here is that, of course, for them, it's about food. And we see that, first of all, Christopher got the pigeons to be able to work for food. This is important because to we need to kind of give you that analogy with a person like myself. I have the option of work and also had the option of gambling, and so therefore they want to see kind of what happens to this bird if you kind of introduce gambling. And we see for the pigeons that having a bit more time, access to food is kind of the gambling experience for them. But what we see at the bottom here, that as soon as the initial experience of gambling kind of is over, that it says here, the birds could gain longer access to food via working rather than gambling. However, they didn't go back to the work. They were addicted. Now, obviously, we could end the situation there, and it's all about kind of how we've made pigeons addicted to a particular disc that they can tap on in order to get more food. The sad reality is that they were addicted to this disc, and therefore they started to lose weight and potentially die. Christopher then reintroduced the work disc to them, or actually took away the gambling disc, so it was only the worst disc available, and they're able to kind of go back to normal. Unfortunately, as soon as it says here, however, when the gambler's disc was reinstated, the pigeons hadn't lost their addiction. So for me, this is just an example to kind of explain how compelling the whole kind of reward processes must be for the gambling disc, um, such that these birds kind of couldn't go back to the work disc unless the gambling disc wasn't there. So therefore, instead of focusing on the specification where it just says, let's look at partial and variable reinforcement, I do always open up with operant conditioning. I need you to kind of understand that operant conditioning is part of the gambling addict's system. In the same way that a substance produces reward, what we find is that the consequences of the gambling behavior is seen as rewarding. And so therefore we can expect that if this is rewarding, it becomes more frequent. Now, the sad reality for us as well is that it's not just winning that is rewarding. We see from Custer um, that we can first of all kind of see that how some people's initial experiences could be very rewarding, that they go on to become addicts. But we see from Griffiths, who does a lot of work on this, that it's actually not just winning, that it's actually your other types of reward that you get. You got here, they mentioned physiological, psychological, and social rewards. So I'd ask you to kind of think of maybe some of the films where you've seen casinos and places like that, where you can see all the kind of the flashing lights, the noises, the kind of the drinking, all those types of things are associated with gambling as well. A person can actually genuinely enjoy the gambling experience. So let's move on to then kind of the partial reinforcement. Now, Skinner actually is one of the people who talks about this, and what they say is that winning is, it says here, provides intermittent and unpredictable reinforcement. So intermittent is the one that's related to partial. So partial is part of. So if you can view this experience of kind of saying that gambling is mostly not always an all or nothing type of experience. I mean, it's easy if you look at something like a scratch card where there might be a jackpot. And on a jackpot, yes, you might, that's a kind of a win all experience, but you could get a combination that pays you out just a small amount. And if any of you have ever kind of bought a lottery ticket, even just matching two numbers and winning your money back is actually quite a pleasurable experience. And so, of course, what's happened here, Skinner also refers to unpredictable. Now, unfortunately, that is intertwined with this idea of variable. You can't kind of move the partial and variable apart, certainly when it comes to Skinner here. And it says that um, ultimately what is happening is you're learning a pattern of behavior that is very difficult to extinguish because we, first of all, are reinforced partially when we perhaps win a small amount. Secondly, we also know that we ultimately learn how to lose because we repeatedly lose, and possibly where a behavior would be extinguished, then we do win, which is unpredictable, and of course that reinforces the behavior all again. So when we look at partial reinforcement, we see a situation like this where somebody potentially is kind of tied to that dice, kind of not able to move away from it. It says, due to the nature of gambling, people continue to gamble because they get partial reinforcement. So in other words, if, for example, a person gambled and never got any form of reinforcement, you'd find that that behavior potentially could easily kind of be taken away. Oh, sorry, I am yawning, and I know you probably don't want to hear that. Okay, so partial reinforcement, remember, it's mostly about you win partly. And so that has the same reinforcing nature as winning because you are still winning. It it then I add to this and I do don't often use furthermore in the knowledge part of this. I just said that we need to kind of add this to the variable side of things. And I know I've got a section specifically about variable, but for me, the variable and this provides this unpredictable nature of gambling. So what I say here is that you ultimately may go long periods of not winning because that's how kind of dice works. It's kind of like if I flipped a coin, I may actually flip a coin three or four, five, six, 7 times in a row, land on the same side. And of course, I can't predict necessarily what's going to happen. I can look at the statistical chance and I see it's 50-50, but of course, every time I actually do this, it's just literally kind of resetting itself. So just to kind of explain this a little bit further, I do have a section on variable reinforcement. And it says the uncertainty of when a payout is due keeps players playing longer. The uncertainty keeps players playing longer. Now, I mentioned possibly in the lessons about kind of this idea of maybe watching a sports game. And in a sports game, what I really want is to have people scoring goals. Okay. However, what I actually have is somebody in goal who could stop the goal, or have other players. So there's never quite it's never quite as straightforward as an open goal and a shot at it. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And I suppose that's what variable reinforcement does. It puts us to a point where we are potentially finding players who are kind of challenging. So when I'm gambling, I don't know if I'm going to win. I always have this nature that I could not win. So therefore, it's kind of actually just makes it a bit more exciting. So gambling machines, for example, use this unpredictable nature. They actually have a particular type of variable reinforcement called the variable ratio of reinforcement. They have to work out a kind of an algorithm to ensure that there is kind of the right type of payout in the long term. So I have an example here. Now, this example is completely kind of ridiculous because it would never be as simple as 1:4, and that's potentially a ratio I have. But if there was a ratio of 1:4, I could win on the second time, or could win on the fourth time, or the sixth time, or there's. But as long as each time I play, um, and we kind of add them all up, ultimately, what we find in experimental statistics that ultimately the overall ratio has to represent what we should have. So this is the key to the difficulty with trying to extinguish the gambling behavior in an addict, is that every time the gambler plays, yes, they have a very high statistical chance of losing, but they also at the same time have a very they have a statistical chance that they could win. So the only way I can assure that I don't ever win, say the lottery, is that I don't buy a ticket. So even though I know that I may not win, I know that if I have got a ticket, I could win. And that's what the variable nature and the unpredictable nature of gambling really does to the person. It puts us in a situation where we don't necessarily know kind of where things are going. Now, of course, there's quite a lot of knowledge there for you to have a look at. I've mentioned operant conditioning, partial, and variable reinforcement. Now, you could look at that and go, okay, so I don't necessarily need the operant conditioning, but it's kind of difficult to take it out because in terms of learning theory, we really do need to appreciate that learning theory is there. So one of the things I did think about is when we move to evaluation is whether you kind of use your operant conditioning as kind of your counter. Because if we look at some of these evaluation points, the key is that they're quite negative. I don't feel learning theory is as strong as an explanation for gambling addiction as it was for smoking addiction. So we see things like this, like that we can't appreciate the learning theory explaining all forms of gambling because there's so many different types of gambling, and yet not all of them will have this direct kind of kind of partial variable reinforcement aspects to it. The examples that I use, for example, scratch cards. Scratch cards have a very kind of short kind of stimulus response type of kind of situation. But sports betting kind of often takes months and months in order for it to be fulfilled, especially if you're doing like a season-long thing. We also know that sports betting may require some skill, and as such, and skill and kind of maybe the enjoyment of something due to skill may not be the same as if you are going into a casino, for example, and receiving stimulation and feeling pleasure. So, so therefore, it's important for us to kind of appreciate that these different types of betting in themselves, learning theory can't fully explain in terms of kind of understanding the gambling addiction. So therefore, it has to be a limitation. So the contrast could be, or the however could be, is that we need to kind of not deny that gambling in itself is pleasurable. So anything that's pleasurable is likely to be repeated. So, so maybe think about how you could use this point in terms of an evaluation. The second evaluation point is that it's all about individual differences. What we do find is that only some people become addicted to gambling, yet we may kind of all kind of have similar experiences. So we see it says here many people experience positive reinforcement, but few people become addicts. So if this is the case, then learning theory kind of has to be excluded because with learning theory, it kind of says, well, if you do have positive reinforcement, then you should go on to kind of have kind of develop this further this further kind of behavior that you want to repeat. And so maybe the kind of what I'm saying is that there's other factors, other psychological factors. So, for example, I may walk into a casino and ultimately maybe even have quite a positive experience, but my psychology of kind of worrying about debt or worrying about my family or what people think could kind of override my overall kind of sense of enjoyment or reward, and therefore I don't become an addict. So there's something else that's changing why I don't become an addict. So kind of two kind of negative points there relating to the fact that learning theory doesn't answer all forms of addiction, and learning theory can't explain why some people can have similar experiences but not go on to become an addict. Now the last point is a little bit more complex. So if I'm going to look at other factors, we need to kind of look at the kind of the big picture. Now, we got two explanations for addiction, and certainly one of them is going to be the cognitive model. It's the next one we're going to look at, and for me, that's actually quite a compelling explanation. But what I'm trying to do here, it says here, there's some support for the claim that an early big win can lead to persistent gambling behavior. So in other words, I'm kind of partially saying that this idea of initial reinforcement, but what is what you need to make clear to the examiner here is that I'm actually kind of saying that what the big one is doing is changing a person's thoughts and not actually reinforcing the gambling behavior. So Sharp did look at kind of a series of gamblers and certainly said the placement of wins early in the gaming experience and the patterns of wins actually leads to irrational thoughts. So, in other words, it's not that the behavior of gambling is reinforced, it's the irrational thoughts that are reinforced. So, ultimately, for example, somebody who goes on to become a gambler may be a gambler because of these irrational thoughts, but it was their initial experiences that changed things. And we see some of the initial experiences could be that if I have a big win or something like that, that I might have an illusion of control, that I might believe, oh, actually, I'm better at gambling than somebody else because look at me, I've won early on and I keep on winning, or something along those lines. Or it could be that it changes the way I think about my wins and losses. So it says here, overestimation of the chances to win and an underestimation of things like of losses. So therefore, what the learned behavior has done is just kind of affected my ultimate cognitions. So, in short, it's not necessarily massively expanded upon in terms of questions relating to learning theory, but it has kind of shown us that we can't just rely on learning theory as an explanation for gambling, and leads us quite nicely into the next topic, which will be on the cognitive model. That's what I'm going to do next, and I'm happy to kind of end here, and I hope that you found this video useful.